Well, good Friday afternoon, countryside. Thanks for joining me. Sorry, I have been quite under the weather all week. However, I'm aside from a lingering cough, I'm feeling a lot better today. Voice is still a little bit weird, but oh well, we'll get through that, won't we? This week, I read yesterday. Actually, I read Matthew 22 as part of my devotions, and what I want to look at today is Matthew 22 verses 34 to 40. If you grab a Bible and you open it, it probably says the Great Commandment over this section. Now, if you read the entire chapter, you will notice that this is a record of Jesus' interactions. He gives the parable at the wedding feast, and then he engages the Pharisees over paying taxes to Caesar. He engages the Sadducees over the resurrection of the dead. And then we come to the Great Commandment. And just previous to this, at the end of his interactions with the Sadducees, now you have to understand that the way these Gospels are written, this probably didn't all happen on one day. This is probably, Jesus probably didn't have the Pharisees lined up in one section and the Sadducees lined up in another section. He had given his talk and then he's, got these guys. But at the end of his interaction with the Sadducees, we read, and when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. And then we jump right into the Great Commandment. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they got together. This is Jesus puts down all of the questions. He answers. He's God, so he answers perfectly all these questions. And then they get together and they send one last guy to test Jesus. And he asks Jesus, teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And then we read this, and he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, here's a couple of things I've run into in my life in regards to the great commandment. There are folks that believe that if we're talking about the great commandment, because Jesus said, all the law hangs on these two things: love God, love your neighbor. That's how it gets boiled down to a lot of people. A lot of people, especially in progressives in Christianity, would say that, see, no law. All we have to do is love God and love ourselves. The only problem is those people are typically talking about loving God how they feel like they want to love God, and loving others like they want to love others. So they want to feel like they can determine and dictate all these things by themselves. Sorry, I forgot something. I forgot to turn the light on here. This is how you know I'm not really a blogger or anything, because I'm terrible at this. There, now you can see me. I'm not in the dark. Sorry about that. Anyhow, so they believe that, I can love people how I want to love people. Now, here's basically Jesus saying, listen, all of you has to be given to God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Everything has to be given up. Everything has to be turned over. Everything has to be put in subjection to God first. You see, this is what Jesus is saying. Everything has to be put in subjection to what God says and who God is in his word before you can even start loving others as you love yourself. Matthew Henry says some interesting things on this. He says, our love of God must be sincere, not in word and tongue only. All our love is too little to bestow upon him. Therefore, all the powers of the soul must be engaged for him and carried out toward him. And then he goes on to say, to love our neighbors as ourselves is the second great commandment. There is a self-love which is corrupt. We should all admit to that. There is a corrupting self-love. There is a self-love that puts us first, puts us on the throne, tries to remove God from the throne, puts us as the center of the universe. That is a corrupt self-love, he says. And the root of the greatest sins, and it must be put off and mortified. But there is a self-love which is the rule of the greatest duty. We must have a due concern for the welfare of our own souls and bodies, and we must love our neighbor as truly and sincerely as we love ourselves. In many cases, we must deny ourselves for the good of others. By these two commandments, let our hearts be formed as by a mold. Do you see that? Do you hear what Henry says? He says, if we love God the way we should love God, if he is Lord of our lives, if we've put everything in subjection to him, then we will begin to love others correctly. And those two things, this is how the law hangs on this. Those two things should form our hearts. We should be being transformed. 2 Corinthians 3:18, by one degree of glory to the next. We are being transformed into the image of Christ. This is of the Spirit and not of ourselves. So all of this stuff, what Jesus is saying, this great commandment, actually, all of the law and the prophets hang on this, because if we do this, then our hearts will be formed rightly, and we will live Christ out rightly towards the world. If we don't, if we try and do this under our own power, if we try and love in our own way, then we will do it incorrectly. We will actually do more harm than good, because we won't be bringing the truth. We'll be bringing our truth. It'll become a relative thing. And we can treat people relatively. I can treat one person one way. I can treat another person another way, because it's all based on how I feel. You see how that works? And so if we're living in relation to God the right way, then we will work towards living in relation to others the right way. We will become better at that as we live over time. And I think that's kind of what struck me as I was reading through Matthew 22 this week. So thanks for joining me. Hopefully that's helpful in your walk with Christ. Love you, praying for you. We'll see you again next week. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.